Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to leave the door open for just a few minutes because I think people might still trickle in, but I think in the interest of not wasting Dr. Holly Graham's time, we'll just get started. So my name is Jody Bender, and I'm the psychologist with Meadow Lake Tribal Council, and I am here to introduce Dr. Holly Graham today. I'm gonna butcher this, but Wakotowin? Close enough. Uplifting one another is what Holly's session is on today. Dr. Holly Graham is a member of the Thunderchild First Nation. She has worked as a registered nurse in northern communities and various other healthcare environments since 1985. Currently, Holly is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology, College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. She also maintains an active practice as a registered doctoral psychologist, working primarily with individuals who have experienced trauma and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Her research is strength-based with a focus on First Nations health, mental health, and wellness. So please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Holly Graham.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I have to say I'm not going to be as funny as your last speaker. I am more serious, but what I'm hoping is I have prepared some content to share with you, and much of what I'm going to say is going to build on the previous plenary session, except we're going to have a little more strategies, and what I really want to do is encourage people to ask questions. So I think that that's really helpful, and there is a microphone right in the middle over there where you could go at any point to ask questions. And since there's a small group here, it looks like everybody's going to get a mug. This is Nehewi Chituin, Cree Helping Cree. So one of the projects I do research with is Little Pine and Palm Maker, and it's looking at crime prevention. And two elders, late Austin Tatusis and late Jacob Pete, they both went to residential school with my mother, and they asked me to come and write this project grant, and we were fortunate to be funded. And they said, we want to call this project Nehewi Chituin because we want to start really building greater capacity for Cree Helping Cree. Like, how do we lift each other up? And in that, so, and then the other thing, as a psychologist, I have an active practice. One of the things that I'm always sharing with people is that wellness is an everyday thing. It's not just when a crisis happens or we have a loss. If we want to really be on that journey of Mi'kmaq, it's an everyday thing. So I just wanted to share that with you here. So I'm so grateful every time I get a chance to come and speak and visit with my relatives. Some of you have already had some conversations. We know each other. We have relatives. We're related. And that's very uplifting and really, I think, important because we have to spend the time to talk when we find out how we're connected, and often we are. So now this is not advancing. Of course, you know, you come in before and you work it and it's all advancing perfectly. What happened to our IT? Are they just kind of freezing?
Escape out of your presentation and then go back in.
It's not even escaping.
Oh no, I'm really bad at tech. Oh goodness, let me see if they're.
So while she's finding someone to help us with this, and I don't have a free microphone here, I want to talk a little bit more about what she talked about, you know, flipping your lid. Did she show you guys the bird? Did she do this? Yeah. So what is really cool about this is if we think about this as our brain, and our thumb is the reptilian part of our brain. That's the oldest part of our brain, and it develops first. And this is the part that's wired for survival. And this is also where the fight, flight, freeze, and the fawn response is in this part, the old part of the brain. And that's why if you get an injury to the old part of the brain, it's in the brainstem there, that people don't live. But if they get injured on the cortex, which is the above on top and the prefrontal, people can survive. So when she's talking about flipping our lids and what causes that, I like to talk about how do we know when we're about to flip? You know, like what is it that goes on that makes us feel that, you know, that I'm all of a sudden losing my cool? And we get into the fight-flight response when we are activated that there's a threat to us, and that's what happens. So I think she's done a good job here of getting us going. So that's what I kind of want to talk about, is a little bit is like, how do we keep that on and how do we recognize it? So if you have two people having a conversation and they're having enjoying themselves, then all of a sudden something happens and they have a disagreement, and then one person, or maybe both people. So the problem is not so much if one person kind of loses control in the sense that they're feeling this threat, because this person is still in control in the sense of, I can make choices. That's all it means when we say I'm in control. I'm connected to myself and I can make choices, right? When this person flips their bird, what happens is access to the part of the brain that is frontal lobe like logic, we cannot access it. So when our little people or even adults happens when they're in this state, they can't actually think logically. So this is where we just have to learn to sit with them. I'm going to show you some pictures. And then the real problem is when both people are in this state. They've been aroused and there's threat, and now neither of them can access the part of their brain where they can actually think and make choices. So what's really important is if we understand what it is that makes us start to feel that we're losing control, in the sense like basically feeling threatened, and then what we can do. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm also hoping to field some questions for those. I'm from Tanishaw First Nation. Beosu-Oasis is my community, and that's just a picture of my mother and myself and my daughter. And we always pick berries. We're picking choke cherries. And so this is my mom a couple years ago. We just celebrated yesterday her 84th birthday. So she's 84. She's a fluent Cree speaker. So we heard a lot this morning about acknowledgement, and we heard about the power of relationships. And it really is the path forward to when we look at dealing with everything that's happened in the history of colonization. And relationships, two-part. The relationship that I have with me, myself, like how I treat myself, how I talk to myself, and then the relationships we have with others. If I can start addressing how I talk to myself, and that's called interpersonal communication, and make that more positive, then I'm more likely to have that when I talk to others. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we support ourselves so we can support others. It's just like when you're in an airplane and you're getting ready to take off and they have the announcements and they say, if we lose oxygen in here and the oxygen masks come down, put your own mask on first and then people beside you. So how we uplift one another is by learning how to uplift ourselves. And the better we can do that, keeping our lids on, taking care of ourselves and showing our family and our loved ones, those different scripts, like how do we handle intense joy? How do we handle intense grief and loss? And then that's when we can, work moving forward in the way that's going to be more helpful. And I do want to say, even though I'm talking a lot more from the physiology, what happens in our body, I want you to know our body is our best friend. And the more we understand it, the better we're able to understand the signals that it gives us and read other people's body signals as well. But I do want to say, when we look at healing and the integration of a holistic spirit is the first and foremost. It's so important. And I'll leave that to Gaiteak and our knowledge keepers to talk about that in our ceremonies. I'm fortunate that my mother raised me in it, and I was dancing Sundances starting 9. My Cree name is Okamawatikskwo, which is after the Okamawatik, the pole in the center. So I feel really blessed that I had that opportunity. As I'm talking, I want you to think about, fire. We all have this energy. I was doing some work in my community in Thunderchild, and we were talking about suicide, suicide prevention. And they said, we don't have a word for that in our language. We don't talk about suicide. They said the closest we can think of is fire. When the fire gets low and is having a hard time to burn, that's when these types of thoughts come in. And then we see, unfortunately, some of that behavior. So I'd like you to think about your own fire in your body. When we think of fire, the elders shared, but if you look at other cultures, I lived in Japan for a while in Tokyo, they look at chi, they've all described this life force in different ways, but they said, think of fire. The other thing I want to say, wellness is basically, it's a lifestyle. Wellness is an everyday thing, and it looks at really the spirit, body, and mind, and it's about balance. And I think we always have to talk about, what makes it better, how do we cope, and we hear the word resilience. I'm not a real fan of that word, but it's really how do we make sense of what's happened to us and understand that we can all get better at working through the losses that we have and experience every day. And we do that by things and we can all learn how to do this, and anyone can do it. So really, it's a skill that we can teach. And, I really appreciate what she said about, people, and we're born and we're wired to attach. And I think one of the saddest things I saw when I was in nursing training, I did my first pediatric rotation. And when babies are born, how they're all tightly bundled, their arms are tight, their legs are tight. And I saw my first failure to thrive. And I don't know if you've ever seen that. And that's actually a medical condition when a baby is born and they didn't attach to someone, and they'll actually die. They won't eat, they disconnect from everyone. And this baby just lied there with its arms just straight out and its legs straight out, and it just looked to the side. And I was very young. I was 17 years old, and I'd never seen anything like that. And it really impacted me. And that was when I first started learning about how important it is about connection to ourselves, and then connecting to other people. So if we're not connected to ourselves, it's very difficult to connect to others. And when we look at the history of colonization, it was all about disconnection, right? So anything that is about recovery and moving to that path, it's about connection. So I just wanted to bring in, it's just relationships. And if we don't have healthy relationships in our family, then we can still access that with our teachers and friends and parents of our friends. There's other ways that can happen, culture, ceremony, those types of environments. So it is really important to know that relationships are the foundation, because we are wired to connect. And when we aren't connected to people and we don't feel connected, that is actually what takes many people down that dark tunnel. The past does impact the present. And I know there are psychologists and doctors who say solution focused, let's just move forward and forget about it. Well, I would say that many people can't, particularly when we look at the history of colonization, and I know what my mother experienced, is you can't forget that. And we now know with the body and the science that it's stored in our body. Until we can make sense of it, it actually doesn't go away. So because we're talking about trauma, I just wanted to talk a little bit about triggers and to remind you our body is our best friend. So if I get activated or someone says something or I smell something and all of a sudden I'm feeling unsafe, that's just my body saying, we recognize this. Last time we were around this, we got hurt. So warning, warning. So your body is really trying to prevent more trauma or something else negative happening. And there are things we can do, when we start to realize this, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So triggers are just your body's way of saying, hey, I need some help. This still really hurts. And so when we look at it like that, it's not so scary, and it's easier to understand if we see someone who's being triggered, who perhaps is going into a fight-flight response, as we understand that they feel threatened and their body is just giving them the big red light. Hey, we don't want to go there again and be hurt again. So when we talk about trauma, there's many different definitions, there's many types of trauma, but it's just simply, if you look at it, it's any event that happens that a person does not have the capacity to cope with. So what is traumatic for a little person may not be traumatic for someone else. So it's age appropriate and developmentally and the skills that we have. And so this is where we get into trouble when people, we call them little T's and big T's. When a person has a little thing, like say a child falls down. I remember there was a powwow and my niece's little boy, he fell down and he scraped his knee and it was bleeding. And then he went up to one of my relatives, oh, that's just a scrape, like just quit crying, because he was really crying. And so I just looked at him and I says, come to Grandma. And so I put him on my lap. I says, tell me what happened. She talked about acknowledgement, like, tell me what happened to you. He said, I was running and I was told not to run and I wasn't listening and I heard, and he's just blubbering. My brother calls it blubbering, eh? And so I said, oh, I'm so sorry this happened. Let's look at it, and cleaned it up. And that is a simple act of acknowledgement and kindness. And I said, it's okay to cry. Little boys, little girls, women, men, we have tears for a reason. And so he looked at me and I have my arms around him. And then we repaired that because he had an experience that he didn't know could happen. And that's when our little people, our babies, is they look to us to let them know that they're going to be okay and how am I going to survive this? And we've all scratched our knees, so that's an easy one, right? We know how to help. Trauma, unfortunately, is very common. And it's common with all peoples. It doesn't matter where you live in the world, what color your skin is. Unfortunately, it's very common. So when we look at Canadians, 3/4 of all Canadians, have had some type of trauma exposure, and almost 10% of Canadians meet the criteria to have a diagnosis of PTSD. And so it's very real. And she talked about ACEs, and I'm glad that she mentioned that because I think it's really important to know little people's brain is not done growing and developing. In fact, it's not really done until you're about 26 or 28 years old. So that's why when our children hit to be about 28, 30, they tend to make more sense and they can actually do a little more consequences and understand. Because the frontal lobe, the part of the brain here, remember we talked about this is the old part on top, the part that can make sense of things and say, hey, when I did that last time, that was good, or when I did that last time, that wasn't good. That prefrontal cortex isn't done growing till you're about 26, 27, 28 years old. So that's really important when we understand how the brain develops and is wired. So the more of these adverse childhood experiences people have, the more it impacts your health because it actually has changed how your body's working inside your body, and we can't see that. So it's really hard when we look at people, and mental health had such a stigma about it because if someone has a broken leg or broken arm, we can tell that they've had an injury and we can be appropriate and say, I'm very sorry that happened to you, how are you doing? Or if someone has a white cane, we know they're visually impaired, we make adjustments. But when someone's been hurt inside, we actually can't see it. And so that means that they're more likely, in fact, will have less caring and less empathy. So this ACEs was done with white middle-class people who all had degrees in California, 17,000 of them. So the reason I'm sharing this is they were well-resourced, they weren't living in poverty, well-educated, and they weren't facing many barriers that our relatives face. And what they found with them, and these were the 10 questions, is that trauma was relatively common. And then they went through their health records and they could actually see the diseases they developed later in life. So if you look at these, each one of these is worth 1 point. So if your parents got divorced, that's 1 out of 10. And you look at that. So the magic number is 4. When you have to have 4 out of 10, then that's when we look at more health challenges. And they're unfortunately very common. So this is with white, well-resourced people, how common these types of traumas are. And so, 28% had physical abuse, 1 in 5 sexual abuse, and the health problems. So there is this link. Science has proved when little people have this type of exposure, and then of course none of the good things that can counteract this. And there's many good things that can counteract this. If a person, if you or I, my ACE score is very high, if we have good relationships with people and support, we can actually counteract because we can settle the physiology inside the body. And when we can settle what's going on inside, then we have less of those health concerns. But if you look at the concerns, is when you look at cardiovascular disease, so, and we look at high blood pressure and we look at diabetes, those conditions are very high in our communities. In fact, my grandmother passed away with that. She had her leg amputated, and very common in our families. But that actually has a basis. Part of it is in trauma. So I think it's really important to understand that we just didn't end up having all these health disparities, and we didn't just end up being sicker than everyone else. It's not an accident. It's a direct result of what has happened. And if we know this, then we don't feel bad about ourselves. We feel, in fact, proud of our ancestors that they survived against all odds, insurmountable odds, that they still survived. And we're still here. And we're probably in a time of survivance and thrivance where culture is coming back, language is coming back. I understand some Cree, but because of my family's experience in the residential school, my mom didn't want me to speak Cree because of what had happened. But now there's that revitalization and we're prioritizing it, and we want our young people to learn and to be fluent. We look at suicide attempts, very high when you look at ACEs. So I just wanted to share this because when we look at our history of our relatives and our ancestors, they had the ACEs plus, because there have been no official scores like for colonization. And if you look at why do people feel overwhelmed? Part of truth and reconciliation is, and that was touched on by the last speaker, is until we know the truth of what happened and we can kind of acknowledge and process how that's impacted us, it's really hard to move forward. And it can really change that sense of I'm just a failure, I just can't do any better, or I'm just no good, I'm not lovable, or I'm damaged. We can have some of those, we call them negative cognitions, and they can be really strong. That has come with contact. And so we can see this whole history of that it's been intertwined, this relationship. And then as a result, the responses, we see, what has been inherited, the intergenerational grief and trauma and poverty and the disconnection. And when we look at internalized depression, I now believe those things that people say about me. And when I start to believe that I have no capacity and no ability, that's the most harmful at all. That's my self-esteem. I can't do that. So I think it's important that we know this history, that we just didn't end up all of a sudden born into this situation where we are, that there's been generations of how this has affected our bodies and our blood, our DNA. And the good news is that we can heal in the sense of, not healing in the sense that we can wipe it and it doesn't have an impact, but recover. And this intergenerational grief, if we're just not able to have the time to deal with it, it keeps being passed on. And I spoke about the internalized depression. So presently, I wanted to share this story because when it's a good time, a celebration, we have no problem connecting with people. We shake hands and we'll say, how are you doing? And we're all good, right? Well, this is a picture of my Rottweiler on the other side. His Cree name's Ayaman. My mom calls him fearless and hard. And he's 9.5 years old. So those of you who know Rottweilers, their lifespan is 8 to 10. And he developed, he had emergency surgery, and he had problems with his prostate that very quickly progressed, so he had to have, to be neutered. And this just happened March 5th was when he had surgery. So I pick him up at the vet, and we come home, and he was in a daze. He was just literally like a daze. And he was on the couch, so I went up to him. So I was aware, and I noticed that he just was not himself. And I put my arms around him, and I just held him. I honestly held him for 2 hours until he moved away. And it was silence because, you can't really have a lively conversation with your dog, and he's sedated. And I wanted to share that because sometimes we think big, strong people, he's a ferocious Rottweiler. We think sometimes men often aren't comforted the same way. Little boys aren't comforted the same way. It doesn't matter who we are. If we're alive, and we're all alive, and we have a spirit, and so do animals, is we will do better when we're nurtured and comforted. And a lot of people are terrified of Rottweilers and would never think for a moment that they may need comfort. So I share this just because it really struck me, because I specialize in trauma as a psychologist, and so much of my time I spend with people is holding that silence and sharing that moment, that pain, and whatever the emotions are with them, and not running away, being there and just staying there. So it's really important, and there are no words we can say that can take it away, because we can't undo it. But we can make it better by actually being willing to stay there. And so he's recovering, and if you think about it, he had junk, he'd been intact for his whole life, and then all of a sudden it was like, Mom, I have no junk anymore. Like, he knew what happened, and there was this sense of he was completely dazed, disoriented. So when you think of someone who's flipped their lid, the fight-flight response, they can't make sense of their environment. And in fact, they can't even determine that they are safe. And that's when they need someone, you or me or someone there, to come in and to do that grounding in the sense of, I'm here. And in that sense, I could put my arm around him. So I just wanted to share that because it's so important to know. People get scared when they see people have triggers, or they're having a body memory, or those different things, or crying. We go to wakes and when our relatives pass. And really how we can help process our own feelings is by sharing that moment and allowing ourselves to feel. Because that's being connected. Connected is allowing ourselves to feel. Disconnected is what people do when they want to feel different. And that could be shopping, that could be drugs, that could be food, it could be any number of substance misuse of any different types of things. And so it really is about learning to be connected in our body and to be present. And when things don't feel good and feel overwhelming, knowing that that will pass and how we can support each other. So trauma-informed guide, trauma-informed practice, what does that mean? This was developed in BC, and it just really takes into account that people experience trauma. And what do? We want to make them feel safe. We want to give them choice and control. And that's really what it comes down to. So when I was holding my dog, after about an hour, I'm not very comfortable. And I said to him, did you want to lay on Mama's lap? Now, he's well trained. I could have just said lay or down, and he would have flopped down. But I gave him the choice, and I said, do you want to lay on Mama's lap? And then he just relaxed, and he laid, and he put his head on my lap. So it may sound funny, but you can do these approaches with children, with everyone, is give them choice of what would help them feel better. So we have to know about trauma. That's one of 4 things. We have to understand how it affects us, because we have to understand how we can mitigate and counteract that. And we have to work at building trust in our relationships and safety. Like, what does that look like? And that looks different in every environment. And we have to give people choice. You will all have a copy of the slides, so don't worry about it. I always like slides because sometimes speakers say things when I'm going to conferences, and I just want to get it down, and I can't, write it down and listen. So I'm one of those people who just likes to give all the information. And then the 4th thing, which is really important, is the strengths-based, is we look at what are they doing well. Everyone we meet is doing something because they're still standing. Everybody has strengths. But this is where it's up to us as healthcare providers or practitioners in whatever capacity that we role model what it's like to stay like this. And sometimes when we feel like we may be losing it, how we bring it down, we will impact more people by showing how we do that versus if we have people who are working with little people and they're having trouble, right? So I remember when I went through, of course, I don't know if we're First Nation, if we can ever get away from trauma, we have more trauma. But I remember I was working in the States as a psych nurse, and I was very violently assaulted, and 10 of my teeth were fractured, and there's a bunch of work done to my lower jaw. And I remember my children, they were really small. They were 7 and 4. I have 2 children. And how do I provide this script, right? I needed for them to know. I said, Mama's okay. Mama's going to be okay, but Mommy is sad right now, and Mommy's face hurts a lot. And but I'll be okay. And it was terrifying for them, right? Because they'd never seen my face. And it was something that was really difficult. But by me being real and not trying to pretend it was okay or talking about it when the kids weren't there, I showed them the script for how you handle things when you're hurt. And I said, sometimes Mommy may have tears sometimes. And I said, and that's okay. And if you want to make it better, you can ask me if you can come give me a hug or just come sit beside me. So I gave them a way to help me, to be a part of comforting me. So this is really where this is important to understand, when you're fighting for this because you don't feel safe and you want to stay in there because we can reach out. To do this, it has to be a culture. Your bosses have to be on board. You have to have education, and you have to have supervision, people checking in on you, and you have to support self-care. And if we want to uplift one another, then we have to learn how to understand our own body so that we can help others. And I know you hear that over and over, but it really is true. And so wellness is really about self-care. And the better we engage in that, the more that we're able to be there for other people. We're able to care more for other people. We're able to notice. I often walk my dog along the river, and I see people through the years sitting in their vehicles crying, just crying their eyes out. And I actually stop. I go up to them, and I tap, and I just say, are you okay? And they're always shocked, kind of like they're a little taken back, first of all, that I would come and knock on their door. And they say, yeah, I just had a huge disappointment, I didn't get this, or my boyfriend dumped me, or, I've heard different things through the years, but I always stop and check because I think, what if? What if I could have made a difference? So how do we know we need help? And she talked about sleep, and I have to say I sleep very well. I've been blessed with that, and there's a lot of things I do, but when your sleep goes, everything else spirals downhill. And part of that is because when we sleep, that's when our brain rests, and that's when our brain actually starts to regenerate, and it's like a filing cabinet. It starts filing everything that's happened to us to make sense. So you go to bed, and you're really upset, you had an argument with someone, it's on your mind, and then you wake up in the morning and you have a solution. It's not so upsetting. It feels a little bit like I can go back and address this. What has happened is your amazing brain, while you were sleeping, has been filing and problem solving, and then you wake up in the morning and you're more settled. So when our brain is working the way it should, we go into REM, which is rapid eye movement, which is part of our sleep cycle. And when we are in that regularly, our brain does a lot of problem solving for us. So if you're not sleeping, you clean your house, get your kids to school, things that you'd normally do, your emotions are too big after a month. And the key is really a month, because the first month our brain can process so much by itself. But after that, we may need some help. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us. It just means at some point in your life and my life, we're all going to need help. So if we get used to thinking that and giving help, we can receive help. So just self-care from these 4 dimensions. And it's really about, when we look at recovery, it's about a balance. And it's so important that we are addressing spiritual, emotional, mental, along with the physical. And I just can't say that here's the recipe for everyone, because it's different. We're all different, and we have different ways. Like for some people, processing ceremony is the most efficient way for their body. And that's fantastic. So this trauma thing, this saber-toothed tiger and this caveman, we can teach this caveman to run better, sleep better. We can teach him to do yoga. We can teach him how to meditate, all those things. But if we don't address that saber-toothed tiger, which are institutions, policy, racism, discrimination, poverty, the social determinants of health, this caveman's going to have a very hard time to actually recover and to change his life. So when we look at interventions, we're always focused on the caveman, and we need to look at the systems and the type of situations that actually create that space and place where that caveman can't rest. But when we're under attack, when we feel we're under attack, it's the amygdala is the part of the brain that's our built-in system. There's 4 things that can happen. Fight, flight, we're very familiar with that. We either fight because we think that we can be okay, or we run away, or we freeze, or fawn. We kind of like a people pleaser. We build a relationship to try and make harmony. And this response is determined by your brain kind of automatically in the sense that you actually can't choose. And it tends to be the first reaction you have the very first time tends to be your default. It's kind of like the default of where you will typically go. But you can have each one of these. It's not always, you always have one and not the other. So when this happens, when we're in this state, we're not in a fight-flight. When we're in a fight-flight, this is what's happened. And so the survival, the reptilian part of the brain is taken over, and it's determining what's the best way. It's like this casino machine. What's the best odds of me to survive this situation? And that's what it does. So short term, this is good. We need this. We can fight better. Our blood, all the energy is diverted. But when it's diverted from our immune system, we're sick more often. When it's taken from our stomach system, our gastrointestinal, we have more stomach problems. And when it's taken from the part of our brain here, where the hippocampus is for memory, then we don't learn very well. So if we're in this state all the time, we're going to be sick more, we're going to have more stomach problems, and we're not going to be able to retain information. So this is significant because our little people going to school. So if they're living in an environment where there's intimate partner violence, it's going to be very hard for them to learn. And this is just the brain of an example of when we're dysregulated, when we're up dysregulated and down dysregulated, and the goal is this general little smooth thing. So physical wellness is important, how we do it. Emotional, so this is the big thing. How do we start meeting those needs inside so that we can be there for other people, right? And so when we look at recognition, acceptance, that's all acknowledgement. And we have to have some limits of what we can do. So this is the one thing I did want to talk about just a little bit longer. And we talk about processing. We've heard that word a lot, how your body processes, or it's unresolved, unprocessed. So processing means that when we have something that happens, that our body, when I say our body, our brain is able to make sense of it. And when it can make sense of it, it can put it in the filing cabinet. But when it can't make sense of it, it just stays. Basically, if you think of it like a tablespoon of butter in a part of your brain, it just stays there. And when we have things that happen or similar, it always touches that butter and we get triggered. So it's always there. And when we're able to process it, and there's different ways you can process it, it's like the butter melts, and that event, you can put it in the filing cabinet, and then you can bring it out and talk about it when you want, and you can put it back in the filing cabinet. But when things pop out, and we can't control them, and we can't put them away, that's when we talk about flashbacks and triggers and things like that. That tends to be, people feel out of control, and they feel their body has betrayed them. So I always talk about, we have to be aware we're feeling something, and then we have to kind of acknowledge, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm scared, I'm lonely, and then accept it's okay that I feel this, but my plan, what am I going to do about it? So it might be go to ceremony, it might be talk to a friend, it might be how am I going to change this situation. The problem is most people go from the first A, they get this uncomfortable body feeling, and they go right to to D, which is the distraction. They go for the walk. They go to a movie. They do anything to not feel this way, so they don't want to feel it. And what happens when we have things that happen to us that it's not safe for us to feel, it just gets stuffed down, if you think of like a ball in your stomach. and it'll just stay there, and it builds like a pressure cooker, and then it makes this more likely to happen. So when I'm doing trauma work with people, I'm always talking about how do we process things that happen to us and make sense of it when we're here versus this happening. And this is part of it. Emotions are basically giving us information about our environment. If I always feel really good when I talk to a person A, then I should spend more time with person A. But if I'm not feeling good, then that's information for me to know how that person is impacting me. So when we think of things that happen in our life, and we all want to avoid feeling it because it's so intense and so painful, it's like this mountain, we can't go around it. We have to go through those feelings, and that's what the hard work is. And these feelings are all these things, and it's important. So all the treatments, most of them, when you look at from Western science particularly, it's about exposure, meaning that we actually have to spend time with what it is that hurt us or is hurting us and be able to think about it in a supported environment. And so many of the treatments are about exposure. And even when we go into ceremony and we pray, it is exposure because we're talking about our loss, our pains, and we're dealing with it and feeling it, and we go into a sweat. So it is exposure, but it's from a spiritual, all very healing. So one of the things that after that assault had happened, I knew I wasn't okay. I was okay in the sense I could still work, but inside my heart and my body, I knew I wasn't okay. I didn't feel joy the same way. And my husband, my ex-husband, my husband, he, yeah, you guys are not fully sleeping. He said to me, I said, I want to talk to somebody, but I don't want to just talk because I think I need more than that. He said, there's this psychologist I send all my patients to. He's a chiropractor. They get in a bad car accident. They can't drive. He said, she's got like a 99% success rate. He said, I don't know any other psychologist like her. So I said, okay. He says, she does this EMDR thing, and I don't know what that means. All I know is that it works. And so I went to see her. And what had happened, I think, from my childhood is I'd pushed down a lot of things, a lot of I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, some of those thoughts were in my head a lot. And then when the assault happened, and then my marriage ended, I just felt like, there's something really wrong with me, And when I went and did the EMDR, it was actually very helpful for me. It really helped my body and my brain to restructure. We don't know how EMDR works. Some theorize and say it's like REM. Remember I said rapid eye movement, our normal dream state, and that's when the brain naturally helps us heal. And some say it taxes the working memory, but in that instance, it helps us to look at an event that happened and not to be so upset by it. Because there's things you're doing, bilateral stimulation that I'm doing when we're going to these painful places. But images don't lie. And if you were to Google and read articles, so the brain on the left, the red is activated, so irritated, I guess you could say. And after the EMDR, after just 4 sessions of an hour and a half, that's the difference. So I do like to share that, and I've been providing EMDR since 2007. The other thing I wanted to talk about is I shared at the beginning of this project, Nehewi Chituin. The 2 elders who have both passed now came to me and they said, we really want to start addressing this, and we know that a lot of this came from residential school because of what was done to us and how they sometimes made us be mean to each other, call each other's names when they couldn't make us cry. They'd have our peers do that. He says that's where lateral violence came from. They told me. They said we never were like this before, and so they said we want to change this. So that's why that project was funded. 2.5 million I got for Little Pine and Pummaker. And it's called Cree Helping Cree. I always remind people that hurt people hurt people. So when people are saying things to us that are hurtful, what I just do is they're hurting inside, and I don't let it come into my heart the same way. And to think about, let's replace that with lateral kindness. I had a friend who was working. I went home to a powwow, and he looked really good. He'd been working, and I said, you look really good. Like whatever you're doing, keep it up. And about 4 years later, he said to me, he says, nobody ever says, when you're doing good or compliments you. I was going to quit my business and I was feeling really down and out. And when he told me that I looked good and keep it up, he said, it really made me feel good. And he didn't tell me till 4 years later. And so it's so important that we're kind. I mean, I've been through phases where I was 120 pounds to 192 pounds when I was pregnant and had toxemia. I was just like a walking water balloon, eh? And so I've been all sizes and shapes. You know, when we're fat, we don't need someone to say, oh my, you sure look fat since I last saw you. What happened to you? You know, how many times have we experienced that? I've experienced that so many times in my community because they're all just happy I got fat, right? And that's what I was thinking. And then I had knee surgery, and I'm on the process of getting that balance back under, but my weight has really changed. And so why do we say these things to each other? And we hear it all the time. You know, I always say, like, don't need, you know, it's just like, I know I don't look like I used to look. But, you know, so it's really, that's the real message. If we could be kinder to people, we have this history I talked about. And if we don't start being kinder, we're going to destroy more of our own people and our little people. And they don't even have to keep colonizing all those things because we're now doing it ourselves. And that's what makes me really sad, is that. And so the other thing, I read this book, Dr. Emoto, he was a Japanese scientist. He's now passed away. And he spent 20 years and he looked at water freezing. Over 70% of our body is water. That's why this matters. And he looked at freezing crystals to different types of music and sounds and to different words. And what he found is words that were positive and uplifting, the crystals were beautiful and symmetrical. And words that were like, I hate you, or you fool, they were not nice. The crystals did not form beautifully. And this is relevant because words do hurt. And when we think about our little people, you know, how we talk to them and how do we uplift them? Do we encourage them? Or do we point out their flaws? We all have flaws. I have many flaws. We're human. So nobody's perfect. And so when we think about the words we say, it actually has a lot of power, and more power than we've ever, I think, really realized. But all the teachings, you know, like I don't know Cree, and I've learned parts, but Late Austin, he spent a lot of time breaking words down for me. I was just, you got to learn to be fluent. And I was working, but he talked about bimote. So if you say walk in English, it's a verb, walk. It's walk. If you say it in Cree, bimote, direct translation is walk. But when you break it down, te is heart. It means walk with your heart. That's the direct translation of our Cree word, bimote. And he said, if we walked with our heart, we felt our feelings when they happen, and we walked with our heart when we talked with others, we could be much faster on this path of, you know, reviving and building our nations up where we want them to be. So it's all about what can we do, what can't we do? And I like the hula hoop. Everything in the hula hoop, I can only control what I think, what I do, my behavior. I can't always control what I think. I'm going to be honest, because we all have random thoughts. But ultimately, I can choose my behavior, what I do. And I can't control what other people do. That's just the truth of it. And the more I try to control other people, I will feel powerless and helpless, because in reality, I can't control them. So the more I spend time on learning about my own brain and what keeps me intact so I can make the best decisions for me is what's good and for people and my grandchildren, versus flipping my lid because so-and-so said something about me that really hurt my feelings. Not that it doesn't hurt, it does hurt. And this is, you know, mentally, are we a Tigger or ER? What's that little voice in your head saying? Does it say, I can't do this, I'm no good? Or does it say, I can do this? I can do this with help. I might need some help, but I can do this. Because we have to pay attention to that little voice in our head. It's called interpersonal communication. And that little voice, you know, can be a critic, starts when we're a little person. Susie's so good at math, she's going to be a mathematician. That Johnny, he's as clumsy as a 2x4, you know, he's not agile. All those little messages we give little people, it is part of what goes on in that record. You know, when you think about, okay, Johnny is hitting Bobby. You always pick on Johnny. You got Johnny and Bobby playing in the schoolyard, and Johnny's hitting Bobby. The teacher comes out and says, Johnny, don't hit Bobby, and takes Johnny away. So Bobby's left there. And if Bobby were to start hitting himself on the head, what will we say? We'd say, why are you doing that? Like, Johnny's gone. Like, stop hurting yourself, right? So physically, we can see that. But what do we do mentally? Someone walks up to you and says, Holly, you know you're ugly and your mother dresses you funny. Think about this. You're a little kid or you're at work. Oh, you're ugly and your clothes, they're outdated or just something that's probably nice compared to what people say. That person walks away. What do? I play that mantra. I'm ugly and my mother dresses me funny. I'm ugly and I play it over and over. That becomes that inside voice. So we are actually hurting ourselves over and over when we actually take those words in that people say and we play that record. And that is very harmful. Stress, part of life. When I'm hungry, my body starts to feel stress. That tells me it's time for food. And stress on many levels, we need it to survive. Otherwise, we wouldn't get water to drink, we wouldn't get food. But really, it's how we react to it. People can say terrible things, and I've had different people say really terrible things. Of course, we all have. And the choice is I can choose how to react. And that's what's really important. So the one thing I did want to talk about, one of the quickest ways to change our mindset from Eeyore to Tigger it's called a gratitude list. You do it for 6 weeks, 10 new things every day, and you say it, and it helps you look for the good things. You get to the point where I'm thankful for that blade of grass, I'm thankful for the way the sun comes down, all those things. The 4 agreements actually is written by an indigenous man in Mexico, and he talks about how we can live some of those ways and be happy and be okay, even though what other people say. And he talks a lot about how people hurt people. And I read this book about every 6 months. You can read it in about 2 hours. And it just reminds me of how to be kind, watch my words, and really do my best. And sometimes my best is better than other days because sometimes I'm sick, sometimes I'm not feeling well, but I do my best. And then there's no regrets. And so this is the gratitude. They were doing this with the military in Ontario, and they found it was so effective and helpful, just teaching your brain to look for the positive. So I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions and just to kind of look at the energy bank. We all have a bank of our own wellness, and we have to know what puts us in the red or what gives us some savings, and we have to pay attention to that. And I hope that we're all our own knights in shining armors, meaning that we become accountable and do the best we can for ourselves so we can do the best for our relatives. So I left. We have about 7 minutes or so for questions. And if you ask a question, you get a mug.
Actually, I might have a couple questions.
That's
I was
good.
thinking about trauma for one. Mm-hmm. And I was going to ask you, well, I'll tell you what's going on with me. As I grew up with trauma. I right now have my daughter's best friend is missing. I'm unable to cry, and I was told it's probably because my brain has shut down as a response to trauma. So I'm just wondering, is there ways that you suggest that we could help do that? I know it's happened to me in the past where I've had to ceremony or go. I had to actually, my best friend died, and it was the hardest death I've ever gotten over. I had to go sit by the water for 4 days, not knowing, because I'm a 60s scoop person, so I don't really know my my ways. I'm learning, as I grew up, and I'm teaching my kids how to move on. I know about the brain. I'm a teacher, so but before this, I was an employment counselor. So I took SOI training down in BC, and it totally made sense to me how PTSD and structure of intellect, how they took people from the army and that, and they tested them and then worked with them with the eye movement, and there was stuff so what I was told, when there's trauma, your brain disconnects. So those synapses in your brain disconnect. And in order to get them to connect again, you have to do those physical things. And if you don't do them, they can also affect not only your emotions and intelligence and ways to overcome things. So the real question I have is, how do I get myself back to that place where I'm able to deal with some of those feelings? Because growing up, I've always held them in. And then I had a time where there was a workshop and it was a trigger for me. So I couldn't stop crying. So right there was like a great fear of, oh no, I can't stop crying. So now I'm 50 some years old and dealing with this trauma of growing up. So how do I slowly get myself there? And I can tell you honestly, through my lifestyle and my life, that there are many of us like that who are scared to deal with that trauma. And I've heard like people say, if I open up, I'm scared I'll never come back. So I know now, like, the brain protects itself. And so how do we slowly open up and, to help ourselves, but not only to help ourselves, to help our kids and help the people in our, that we're working with?
Thank you. That's probably one of the best questions someone can ask, because you're right, it affects most of us. So if we look at our brain, many people, the brain has just decided, I am not in a safe environment and I don't have the support or the appropriate people right here. It is not in the best interest for me to feel, and it stays locked up. So shut down, where you can't access. And that's a big part of why we're talking about trauma-informed practices, is to understand that this is what happens when people don't have the support, is they will lock it down. And so what I can tell you when I see people in my practice, what I do when I take a history is I look at all the things that happen, even like a pet dying or changing schools, losing a best friend. Those are called little T's. It's not like a big T, but those little T's add up, right? Yeah. And so what I do is I'm very careful to titrate what you're talking about. And yes, many people come to see me, they say, well, if I get opened up, I'm afraid I'm never going to get closed down. We call that flooding. And I want people to stay in a window of tolerance when I'm processing, means they can still function, still go to work. So what I do is I call it an EMDR target sheet, and we specifically outline where we're going to go. And I always start with mom and dad, because we all have had complex relationships with our parents. We love them, and yet they've hurt us. That's every human being, except my dog. I remember my husband said when my last dog died, he said, are you going to cry like that when I die? I said, probably not. And my dog has never hurt me. And I share that because human beings hurt each other, right? They're going to disappoint us. And so even when people say, I have a perfect relationship with my mom, we go back and we work with that. And with EMDR, when you talk about the brain, it helps the brain file what has happened. And why the eyes are so important is the eyes are actually, they say if you look at a person's eyes, you can see the soul. The eyes store everything. So if I were to move your eyes, if you were to follow my fingers in different directions, you have memories stored in different places in this visual field. And when you take eyes down, you're taken into the negative things, and you leave a person's eyes up. So the eyes are fascinating. And I've taken training in EMI, which is eye movement integration, where you deliberately have patterns where you take people.
Yeah.
And,
I learned that in life skills, when you look up,
yep.
when you're hurting, and if you're looking down, you're going to cry.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So with EMDR, the woman who discovered it, Dr. Francine Shapiro, she was really upset one day, and she went walking in a field, and when she came back, she felt better, and she thought, well, that's unusual. But there were a bunch of butterflies, and what she realized was she was watching the butterflies with her eyes, and that somehow helped settle her central nervous system, her brain, so that she could make more sense of what's going on. See, our bodies were built to heal. Nobody is not capable. We all have that capacity. But the big thing is, do we feel safe? Yeah. Do we have support? And is this someone who's going to respect our story and keep it confidential, right? Mm-hmm. Even when I chart trauma, I don't chart details because no one needs to know that. And I don't need that documentation to work through trauma with people. Mm-hmm. So a big part when people have went through life like that, they're soldiering on, is because they haven't found the right place or perhaps the right person to start that work with. And then sometimes you'll get bits, and then when you cried, you couldn't stop crying. And then that really scared you because you thought, what if I never stop crying? But you do, and you will. And if you feel like that, that's where you do need to work with someone who's been through the process.
Okay.
You know, because if it's like the blind leading the blind, if you haven't been there and haven't, experienced it, not that you can't help, but it may be more challenging, right? Definitely. So your responses are normal. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. Yeah. Your brain has decided this is what you need to keep going right now.
Yeah. I think my first trauma started at like 5 years old. Mm-hmm. My mom was beat up right in front of me. And so I hid myself in a corner and just covered my eyes and my ears and because I could hear the hitting and it was just me and her. So it was like, and I didn't know, whether she was alive or dead or, but getting out of that situation, it was like
And for a child, their whole world of safety is just with that blown away, right? Yeah. Because you were not safe and you feared for your mother. You didn't know the outcome. Remember, traumas, you don't know what's going to happen.
That's right.
And anxiety. Yeah. So that would actually set your brain thoughts of, I'm not safe, I'm powerless. Mm-hmm. And then that becomes the mantra. Remember I talked about the broken record that goes over and over. I'm not safe, I'm powerless. Yes. Yeah. So thank you. So I think I know that we started late, but I know that lunch is ready. It's 12:06. So please come up and grab the mugs because I don't want to take them home with me. I had to haul them